Welcome to Art Blog on Location with me, Anthony King. Today we're going to be visiting central London, Westminster, to see a sculpture by the French artist Auguste Rodin, and it's called the Burghers of Calais. The sculpture is in Victoria Tower Gardens, literally underneath the House of Parliament and Victoria Tower. It was cast in 1908 and it was installed in 1914 and it was unveiled in 1915. The gardens themselves were created in the 1870s, so make sure you have a look on the blog because we have a great picture of the construction of the park, and it's literally part of Thames Embankment along the river next to the Houses of Parliament and the Palace of Westminster. The fun thing about this park is that it opens from dawn to dusk. There's no official time as such. Rodin was commissioned by the French city of Calais to create a sculpture to commemorate the heroism of Eustace de Saint-Pierre. He was a prominent citizen of Calais during the Hundred-Year War between England and the French. This actually happened in 1347. Now, the burghers are defined essentially as a citizen of a town or city, and it's typically a member of the wealthy bourgeoisie. There is a plaque in front of the sculpture which sums it up beautifully, and this is what it says. These figures, known as the Burghers of Calais, commemorate 6 citizens of that town who offered themselves as hostages to Edward III after he had vainly besieged their town for nearly a year in 1847. The story goes that their lives were spared on the intercession of Edward's queen, Philippa of Hainault. The war between France and England raged, and Calais was under siege by Edward III. The Calais town knew that it was over for them. Edward offered them a deal. I will spare the town if you give me 6 of your prominent citizens. The 4th century writer Jean Froissart documented the story at the time, and it really sums up the spirit that Rodin captured in these sculptures. And I'm going to read to you a translation. I've changed some of the words for ease of translation. And this is the king talking to his advisors. My anger burns in me against this people, but I do not want to be alone against you all. Sir Walter, go back to Calais and tell its commander that this is the limit to my mercy. 6 of the chief citizens of the place are to come out with their heads and their feet bare, with halters around their necks, and with the keys of the town in their hands. With these 6 I shall do as I please. The rest I will spare. What a story. 6 to be sacrificed for the sake of the whole town. And indeed, 6 were brought out, marched over to the king's camp, and their terror has been immortalised by Rodin. However, it's important to mention that the story does have a twist. Auguste Rodin was born in 1840 and died in 1917, and he was known for making realistic sculptures, and his work had such a great influence on sculpture in the 20th century. He was born in Paris. Literally, his art had an influence on the whole world. He became very wealthy and well known from the age of 40 onwards. He's known for creating many iconic worldwide known works, including The Age of the Bronze, The Kiss, The Burghers of Calais, which we're going to look at today, and also The Thinker. I'd say that The Thinker, which was created between 1879 and 1889, is probably the most recognised works in all of his sculpture. Rodin visited Italy, and he viewed the Renaissance art and the great sculptures of Michelangelo, and this was a turning point in his life. And in the piece that we're going to look at today, you can even see the influence of the great Michelangelo. There was controversy in Rodin's life because his sculptures were so realistic. He was often accused of forming molds on living people. Ironically, this actually was done at the time, but he didn't do it. He used his talent to recreate the detail in people. He was really hurt at the time that the gossip went around. There was a lot of gossip about Rodin. As I said, Rodin didn't really become famous until his 40s, and he was very wealthy. He received over 200,000 francs a year for his portraits alone. So let's compare this to Amedeo Modigliani, a very famous painter. He received 20 francs per day. The famous composer Eric Satie couldn't afford his rent of 35 francs per quarter. That puts in perspective how much wealth Rodin had. He lived in a fabulously beautiful mansion in Paris, which is now the Rodin Museum. He was alive at the same time of all the famous Impressionists and was part of that movement. Or he was alive with the birth of that French Impressionist movement. He is a pioneer of sculpture. In 1919, the Paris mansion that housed his works opened in Paris. Let's make our way over to Westminster. Make sure you check out the blog anthonykingblog.com for photographs and an accompanying blog to this audio. I'm walking past the Palace of Westminster right now. As you can hear, I'm standing underneath Big Ben, and we're going to walk around towards the west side of the Palace of Westminster to Victoria Tower Gardens. I'm walking around to the north side of the Palace of Westminster. On my right hand side is Westminster Abbey, and we will be at the Victoria Gardens in a moment. I've just walked across Westminster Bridge, past Parliament, under Big Ben, and I'm now sitting in the Victoria Tower Gardens, underneath the shadow of Victoria Tower. Victoria Tower is a square tower, and it's in the Palace of Westminster, famously known as the Houses of Parliament. The tower is actually on the House of Lords side. Very interesting placement. What a odd piece to put underneath the Houses of Parliament. I'm sitting looking at the statue right now. The River Thames is in front of me. We are literally opposite Lambeth Palace. Now, interestingly, Lambeth Palace is the Archbishop of Canterbury's London base, essentially. And that building is from the 1300s. That's one of the oldest buildings in London. That was here 500 years before Parliament was. So that building was here when this story actually happened. So Victoria Tower Gardens is a beautiful, quiet park. Very quiet, peaceful, kind of hidden. Not a lot of people. You hear the bells regularly of Westminster Abbey and Big Ben. In a way, I always feel like you shouldn't let this peaceful park fool you. You know, this is a place of war. Many people died thanks to the decisions of only a few meters away from here. So in a way, it's probably an ideal place to put the statue. We can see the London Eye, St Thomas's Hospital, as I said, Lambeth Palace, Westminster Abbey, MI5. People of power are here. This is a very long park. At the east end of it is Rodin's The Burghers of Calais. Before we look into detail about the bronze itself, let's take a little overview of the 100 Years' War. Wikipedia tells us the 100-Year War was a series of conflicts waged from 1337 to 1453 by the House of the Plantagenets, rulers of the Kingdom of England, against the House of Valois, rulers of the Kingdom of France, for control of the latter kingdom. Each side drew many allies into the war, It was one of the most notable conflicts of the Middle Ages, in which 5 generations of kings from the 2 rival dynasties fought for the throne of the largest kingdom in Western Europe. The war marked both the height of chivalry and its subsequent decline, and the development of strong national identities in both countries. It's really interesting that during this 100-year war, King Edward III's army, they besieged Calais. King Edward was not really a nice guy, and he ordered that the whole town of Calais be destroyed and everyone in it killed. In the end, he was persuaded by his advisors to spare the town, but at the expense of 6 of prominent people from within the town who were to come out with shaved heads, sackcloth, and they were to be sacrificed, or in the king's words, to do as I please. Apparently it was the advisors, but there's also a story that Philippa of Hainault begged him to spare their lives because she was worried about bad luck on her baby. So this sculpture, it depicts men leaving for the king's camp, carrying the keys to the city in a sacrificial manner. So the Burghers of Calais depicts the men on their way to the king's camp with the keys to the city, shaved head, knowing that they are on their way to their deaths. Well, King Edward, at least he spared their lives in the end, so that's nice of him. But the dread and the terror that was running through the bones of these people, of these heroes, is clear to see, and Rodin captured that majestically. It's interesting to note that the sculpture was originally rejected by the people of Calais because, in their opinion, it didn't portray the heroes of the story as heroic enough. He wanted it at ground level so that people could walk around it and essentially experience the emotion and the terror of the protagonists. However, they disagreed and they wanted it raised up because that was the only way that they could add a little bit of heroism and dignity to these poor 6 heroes. Auguste Rodin's sculpture, it represents freedom from oppression. However, I don't know if that's necessarily true. For me, looking at it, it represents terror. It represents 6 people that are going to their deaths, and you can see this emotion in the sculpture. As I look at it right now, it's double my height. It's very tall, and essentially this is not what he originally intended for Calais. And in my opinion, it actually, you don't get the impressions that you get from photographs because the heads and the emotions so high up. You physically can't see all of the emotions. You have to look up. So they actually did succeed. The original sculpture, sculpted in 1889, was to stand outside Calais town hall, and they later made casts, and this is one of them. And it was bought by the National Art Collection Fund in 1911. Rodin himself came and gave advice on the placement of this. Now, the bronze sculpture weighs 2 tons and its figures are 6.6 feet tall, and they are raised off the ground on approximately a 5 or 6 foot pedestal. Now, legally, only 12 copies of Rodin's sculptures can be made. That's a legal requirement. That is because of forgeries, obviously. There are 12 copies of this around the world, from Tokyo to California to the original in Calais to Rodin Museum to here in Westminster. As I look at the piece right now, we clearly see 6 malnourished, thin to the bone, joints clearly visible, each of them a councilman of Calais. Each of them have their own personality and features. Some of them bow their heads, others look back as if they're looking back to Calais, others have their heads down and their hands on their head, knowing that their fate is sealed. Shoulders slumped, bare feet. They are in a sorry state, knowing that they are doomed. There's a very interesting inscription on the side, Alexis Roudier, caster. Now, he was Rodin's favourite caster, and that is his foundry mark. So that is proof that he made this original sculpture. However, However, there is a really interesting story about this mark. There was once a fraudster called Guy Hain, and he went to jail for faking this signature. So on the side, the actual casting mark of Alexis Roudier, who casted all of Rodin's sculptures, because the original sculpture was sculpted in plaster, clay, but then plaster, and then somebody had to make it out of metal. All of the protagonists in the statue have names. The leader, Eustace de Saint-Pierre, is depicted with a bearded face, and he's kind of towards the middle. Now, some scholars say that he was the leader, the council leader. Others say that he was the richest man in Calais, and others just say that he was a prominent member of the town. Who knows, he could have been all three. But the fall from grace, but then again the sacrifice of these heroes, I have to say the heroic qualities are not seen in this sculpture. We see the terror and fear and anguish and doom. However, it's important to note that Rodin did envisage two possible designs for this, and one of them was at ground level, so that you would become familiar with it and involved in the misery and the sacrifice, as he said, or raised up high on a plinth, so it would stand up against the sky. And I have to say, it really does stand up against the sky and the Houses of Parliament. You really get the sky and the impact of Parliament behind this, and it's a perfect juxtaposition. It really is, of terror and doom. A word about the engraving on the pedestal. The inscription was engraved and carved by Eric Gill. This is a controversial guy, I am telling you now, without going into too much detail. He was known for paedophilia, incest, bestiality, and lots of terrible things, and he wrote about it in his diary, and it was exposed later on after his death. He actually did the inscription underneath this statue. What else can I say? Moving on. Another interesting thing is, as you sit and look at this sculpture, you can't see the entirety of this piece from any one position. You have to walk around to see the sculpture. You have to become a part of it. I think here, specifically in Westminster, the piece is too high. It really is. It's on a pedestal, and even the ground which it sits on is slightly raised. I believe that in the Rodin Museum it's on ground level, which what he originally intended, and I think that this is probably the way to experience this, to become a part of it. The figures have been brought together. They're actually 6 independent figures, and they're showing their own individual feelings, but they are joined at the base, and they're not actually joined at the base in all of the versions around the world. They are separated, but each one of these characters is confronting his destiny. You know, their bare feet, their shaved heads, they have tunics of sackcloth, ropes around their necks, they have the keys, exaggerated keys to the city. Really, really powerful. It is powerful. One interesting thing about this sculpture is that it's not solid. Take a listen. As you can hear, any bronze sculpture over around a foot is generally not solid, and that's because the expense of the bronze itself and the weight. And also, when you get to a certain size, the bronze can't basically keep its form anymore, so it's not solid. However, it's still a couple of thousand kgs. It's very heavy. As I look at the detail of the sackcloth, it reminds me of the Muse Thalia in the British Museum, the detail that he would have put into the plaster of the original sculpture. That said, though, it is not made out of stone. Can you imagine making it out of stone like Michelangelo and the Renaissance greats? That would have been a challenge, not to detract from this beautiful sculpture. He looked up to Michelangelo, and in fact you can see the influence of Michelangelo in the muscles of the arm. I'm looking up right now at the detail of the arms. Much easier to do in plaster and clay than Michelangelo did in stone. The keys are very, very large, and the hands are very, very large. Obviously, they're not realistic, but they are very beautiful. They are symbolic. and they're emphasised by Rodin. And that gives an impression of weight. It really gives an impression of weight, the spiritual weight on their shoulders. For me, looking at this piece, Rodin's genius is obvious. And I think that the piece is actually over and analysed by scholars, and I'll tell you why. The scholars always want to attribute meaning to things which are what they are. And Rodin used to talk about this. He would have the journalists and critics come to his beautiful Paris mansion and review his new pieces. And he used to call them his children, that they were school days, because he would have a new sculpture that he would show them. And they would say, "Oh, what is this called?" And he would say, "Well, it's a vase. It's a vase." And they would say, "Oh no, but the way that the light hits it makes it." And he's like, "Well, okay, why don't we call it this?" And he would just be like, "Okay," and go with it. They would attribute meanings that were not there to his pieces and give names to his pieces which weren't relevant in his opinion. So he would often change the names to his pieces, and the bottom line is this: the genius of Rodin is that he captured the emotion of 6 people going to their deaths, and we as human beings can connect to that. How does he do that? Obviously, they are not smiling. They look distraught. It's not rocket science. And sometimes when you listen to the scholars, you might think that it is complicated, when I don't think it is as complicated. Rodin connected with the emotion in all of us. And he did that very simply. If you were going to die, your head would be hanging probably, you wouldn't be smiling, etc. So that is what he did. And he did it amazingly well. I'm standing in the middle of the grass, looking back at this statue. It's really framed well by Parliament. That really gives it additional magic. It's a beautiful piece. It's a interesting, dark piece. Realism. Rodin gave realism, a real emotion that often it was not shown in classical sculpture at that time. The heroism was romanticized, but it isn't in this piece. So, I thank you for listening. Make sure that you take a look at the website anthonykingblog.com, because there will be an accompanying blog post with photographs and additional information that goes with this audio.